I took in a homeless girl to die in peace, but she uncovered my son's murder. And together, we turned the hunter into prey. My name is Lorraine Whitmore. At 78, I've outlived everyone who once mattered to me, and now I wait for death in this sprawling Boston estate that bears my husband's family name. The Whitmore name used to mean something in this city: power, prestige, old money. Now it's just me, alone in these cold marble halls, with terminal cancer eating away at what's left of my body. The doctors gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago. Time moves differently when you're counting down the days. It stretches and contracts like a living thing, mocking me with its relentless passage. I have no relatives left to visit, no friends who remember the woman I once was. The Whitmore mansion is a mausoleum of empty rooms where echoes of laughter have long since faded. Every corridor holds memories that haunt me. My husband's study where he built his empire, the grand staircase where my son Charles took his first steps, the ballroom where we once hosted the city's elite. Now they're just hollow spaces filled with expensive furniture gathering dust. The only people who cross my threshold these days are on my payroll. There's Marilyn Pierce, my private nurse of 12 years. She moves through my home with clinical efficiency, administering my medications, checking my vitals, managing my slow decay with professional detachment. I've noticed her growing colder over the years, more controlling. She monitors what I eat, who I speak to, when I rest, all under the guise of medical necessity. I sometimes wonder if she's simply waiting for me to die so she can move on to her next aging charge. Then there's Stephen Caldwell, the family lawyer who's handled all Whitmore affairs since my husband's death. He visits weekly with his leather portfolio and steel-rimmed glasses, speaking in that measured voice about investments, property holdings, and the various legal matters that apparently require my signature. His face never betrays emotion, not sympathy for my condition, not impatience with my questions, nothing. Behind that mask, I know he's just tallying the Whitmore fortune he'll soon parcel out according to whatever documents I've signed over the years. Neither of them knew Charles, not really. My only son, my beautiful boy, died 8 years ago in what police called a car accident. I've never been convinced. There were too many unanswered questions, too many averted gazes when I pressed for details. Since that day, trust has become a foreign concept to me. I don't even trust myself anymore. My memories, my judgment, my instincts. They all failed me when Charles needed me most. I've grown to hate this gilded cage. What use is all this wealth when there's no one to share it with? No grandchildren running through the halls, no family gathered around the dining table. Just me, drowning in luxury while waiting for the end, imprisoned in a gold-plated tomb. It was during one of my daily rituals, sitting by the second-floor window overlooking the small park across the street, that I first saw her. A bitter winter afternoon, snow falling in thick flakes that muffled the city sounds. She was hunched on a park bench, this slip of a girl with tangled hair and tattered clothes. Ruby Clark, though I didn't know her name then. What caught my attention wasn't her obvious homelessness or the way she huddled against the cold. It was her eyes. Even from a distance, I could see a hollow emptiness there, but also a defiant spark, a stubborn dignity that refused to be extinguished. Something about her gaze struck a chord in me. I recognized that particular blend of loneliness and loss that no one can hide, no matter how hard they try. It reminded me of my own reflection from decades ago, before I married into the Whitmore name, a poor girl with nothing but determination and dreams. As I watched her, memories I'd buried long ago resurfaced. The hunger, the uncertainty, the desperation of my youth, all came flooding back with surprising clarity. And suddenly, the contrast between that park bench and my opulent prison became unbearable. I didn't want to die surrounded by Marilyn's cold efficiency and Stephen's calculating presence. I needed someone who understood real loneliness, not the professional kind that disappears after the workday ends. I needed someone real in this house of shadows and pretense. The decision came to me fully formed, impulsive yet absolutely certain, the first thing in years that made me feel alive again. I called for Stephen immediately. When he arrived the next morning, I issued my demand. Find that girl from the park and bring her to me, whatever it takes, by tomorrow. Mrs. Whitmore, I hardly think, he began, his forehead creasing with disapproval. I don't pay you to think, Stephen. I pay you to do as I ask. Marilyn heard the commotion and appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Whitmore, in your condition, having a stranger in the house would be most inadvisable, she said softly, but her eyes had narrowed to slits of suspicion. I waved away their concerns with a firmness I hadn't shown in years. Stephen finally nodded curtly and left to carry out my request, though his tight-lipped expression spoke volumes. That night, sleep eluded me. For the first time since Charles died, I felt anticipation instead of dread. But as I lay awake, a strange feeling crept over me. Was Ruby really just a random homeless girl who'd caught my eye? Or was there something more drawing me to her? When I finally dozed off toward dawn, Ruby's eyes followed me into my dreams. And then, in that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, a half-forgotten memory surfaced. Those eyes. They reminded me of Charles's eyes on the day he left home for the last time. The same wounded defiance, the same knowing look of someone being hunted. Stephen returned the following morning, bringing Ruby Clark with him as instructed. I watched from my bedroom window as they came through the iron gates. She walked slowly, her head swiveling to take in the manicured grounds and the mansion's imposing facade. Even from a distance, I could see the wariness in her posture, a stray animal sensing a trap. Her clothes were worn thin, her shoes barely holding together, yet she carried herself with a straight-backed dignity that impressed me. There was no slouching, no cowering despite her circumstances. This wasn't someone broken by life, merely someone cornered by it. I met them in the grand parlor, seated in my usual high-backed chair by the fireplace. Stephen performed perfunctory introductions before retreating to the corner, his displeasure evident in the tight line of his mouth. Please, sit. I gestured toward the velvet sofa across from me. Ruby remained standing, her eyes moving methodically around the room, assessing exits, valuables, threats, before settling on me with naked suspicion. I was not accustomed to being scrutinized so boldly, especially in my own home. It was refreshing. Why am I here? She asked. Her voice was lower than I expected, roughened perhaps by city air or cigarettes. I decided directness was the only approach that would work with her. I'm dying, Miss Clark. Cancer. The doctors give me 2 months, maybe less. She didn't offer the usual platitudes. That doesn't answer my question. I have a proposition for you, I continued. Stay with me until I die. Be a companion, nothing more. In return, I'll leave you enough money to start a new life, wherever and however you choose. Ruby's eyes narrowed. Why me? You don't know me. I could rob you blind. There are security cameras in every room worth robbing, I replied. And you're not the type. You don't know what type I am, she countered. I know enough. I smiled faintly. You understand what it means to lose everything. That makes you different from the vultures circling me now. She glanced at Stephen, then back to me. Is that him? The vulture? I didn't answer directly. 2 months of your life, Miss Clark, in exchange for financial freedom. Ruby hesitated, suspicious of good fortune, as anyone who's lived on the streets would be. I can leave whenever I want? The gates are never locked from the inside. After a moment's deliberation, she nodded. I'll stay. For now. Marilyn's face when I introduced Ruby was a masterpiece of barely concealed revulsion. She showed Ruby to the East Wing guest suite with the mechanical courtesy of a prison guard assigning a cell. Later, I overheard her methodically checking drawers and closets, arranging Ruby's few possessions with latex-gloved hands as if they might be contaminated. Stephen maintained his professional facade, but I caught the calculating glances he cast in Ruby's direction. Weighing, measuring, assessing the threat to whatever plans he had made for my final days and the fortune that would follow. Those first days with Ruby in the house settled into an uneasy rhythm. She kept to herself, emerging mainly for meals, which she ate quickly, as if the food might be taken away at any moment. She avoided Marilyn when possible, watched Stephen with the wariness of a fox eyeing a hunter, and maintained a careful distance from me. I tried to engage her with small talk, about books in the library, the garden views, the history of certain paintings on the walls. She would respond politely but briefly, her eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. She wasn't rude, simply guarded. One night, passing Ruby's room on my way to the kitchen, I noticed Marilyn slipping out, quietly closing the door behind her. When questioned the next morning, she claimed she was checking that Miss Clark had everything she needed, at 2 in the morning, without knocking. Stephen appeared unexpectedly 2 days later with a new stack of documents requiring my signature. Just some arrangements to ensure a smooth transition of assets when the time comes, he explained smoothly. What kind of arrangements? I asked, not reaching for the pen he offered. Nothing that should concern you, Mrs. Whitmore. Standard legal precautions. I set the papers aside. I'll review them later. His smile tightened. Of course. That afternoon, Ruby knocked tentatively on my study door. When I invited her in, she seemed troubled. I overheard something, she said. Your nurse was talking to the gardener about how strange guests shouldn't stay long in this house. They stopped when they noticed me. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. Marilyn has grown territorial over the years. We sat in silence for a moment before I found myself speaking about Charles. Memories of his childhood, his brilliant mind, his quiet determination. I hadn't spoken his name aloud in months, perhaps years. The words came haltingly at first, then more freely as Ruby listened without interruption. Then she asked a question that stole the breath from my lungs. Did you ever doubt the official story about your son's death? I froze, staring at her. For a moment, the carefully constructed wall I'd built around that day threatened to crumble. Why would you ask that? The way you talk about him, she said simply. And the way you don't talk about how he died. I changed the subject, but her question lingered in the air between us. I began to feel that Ruby's arrival wasn't merely a whim of a dying woman. Something about her was pulling me back toward truths I'd tried desperately to bury alongside my son. That night, a stabbing pain in my side woke me. As I reached for the pills on my nightstand, I heard whispers in the hallway. Easing myself up, I crept to my door and opened it just enough to see Stephen and Marilyn huddled in conversation several yards away. If she insists on keeping that girl here, we need a contingency plan, Stephen was saying, his voice barely audible. This time, we can't let things go as far as they did with Charles. My heart seemed to stop mid-beat. As they did with Charles? What were they implying? I closed the door silently, my pain forgotten in the flood of cold dread that washed over me. What had they done to my son? After overhearing that haunting exchange between Stephen and Marilyn, I couldn't sleep. Their words echoed in my mind, opening doors I'd kept locked for years. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would talk to Ruby about Charles. Really talk about him, not just the sanitized memories I allowed myself on better days. We sat in the sunroom after breakfast, morning light streaming through the windows. Ruby looked more rested than when she'd arrived, though wariness still shadowed her eyes. I'd like to tell you about my son, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded, settling into the chair opposite mine. Charles was always an old soul, I said, smiling at memories long buried. Even as a little boy, he was thoughtful, deliberate. While other children rushed through life, he'd pause to examine everything: a leaf, a mathematical equation, a chess move. I described his childhood, how he'd memorized all the constellations by age 7, built intricate models of famous buildings, excelled in everything academic but remained humble. How the servants would find him in the kitchen at dawn, deep in conversation with the cook about bread chemistry or trading Spanish phrases with the gardener. He was the pride of the Whitmore name, I said, my throat tightening. Not because of his achievements, though there were many, but because of his character. He saw people, really saw them, when everyone else in our social circle looked through them. Ruby listened attentively, asking occasional questions that showed genuine interest. But when I approached the topic of Charles's later years, my words faltered. "And then?" she prompted gently. I waved my hand dismissively. The usual rebellious phase. You know how young men can be. But she caught my hesitation. Her gaze intensified, silently asking for the truth I wasn't ready to give. I changed the subject, asking about her preferences for dinner instead. The next day, Ruby explored the mansion's vast library while I rested. She returned to my room that afternoon, carrying a wooden box. "I found this behind some books on the bottom shelf," she said, placing it on my lap. "It has Charles's name carved on the side." My hands trembled as I recognized the box. Charles had made it in woodshop class when he was 14. Inside were letters, dozens of them, most with their seals unbroken. Letters from my son that I'd been too grief-stricken to read after his death. "Thank you," I said evenly, but my heart thundered in my chest. I set the box aside with feigned casualness. "I'll look through these later." Ruby nodded, but the slight arch of her eyebrow told me she saw through my pretense. That night, alone in my room, I opened the letters one by one, arranging them by date. Charles's handwriting evolved from the careful script of his college years to increasingly hurried scrawls in the final months of his life. The content changed too. Early letters were full of ambition and optimism: his business ventures, his travels, his plans for the future. Then came financial troubles, bad investments, mounting pressure. And Stephen Caldwell's name appeared with increasing frequency, first as a trusted advisor, then as a source of concern. "Stephen says the market will turn around, but I'm not convinced. Had another meeting with Stephen today. Something feels off about the numbers he's showing me. Stephen keeps pushing for access to the trust fund, says it's the only way to recoup the losses." The final letter was dated 3 weeks before Charles's death. It was torn in half, with only the first page remaining. "Mom, I think I've made a terrible mistake trusting him." The rest was missing. I sat motionless, letters scattered across my lap, as disparate pieces began connecting in my mind. Charles's sudden financial troubles, Stephen's convenient consolidation of power after his death, and now the overheard conversation. This time, we can't let things go as far as they did with Charles. The next morning, Ruby joined me for tea. Something in my expression must have revealed my turmoil because she spoke with unusual directness. "I lost my family in a house fire when I was 19, she said, without preamble. "My parents and younger brother. The official report called it an electrical fault, but the insurance company refused to pay. Said there were irregularities in the investigation." "I'm sorry," I said, genuinely moved by her loss. The police closed the case within a week. No one seemed interested in why the fire alarm batteries had been removed, or why the back door was locked from the outside. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened around her teacup. People with power decide which truths get buried. In that moment, a connection formed between us, two women haunted by deaths that defied simple explanation, by truths others had deemed inconvenient. Later that week, as Ruby returned the wooden box to the library, she discovered something else. A tarnished brass key with an unusual insignia etched into its head. It was tucked into the lining, she explained, placing it in my palm. My breath caught. This is the key to my husband's study, the one at the end of the west corridor. The room that's always locked? I nodded. Stephen took over that space after my husband died. Said he needed somewhere to store sensitive documents. I hesitated. I haven't been inside in years. Ruby's eyes lit with curiosity. Don't get any ideas, I warned. Stephen would notice if anyone disturbed his sanctuary. She nodded, but I recognized the look on her face, the same determined expression Charles wore when wrestling with a particularly challenging puzzle. Ruby Clark wasn't someone to back down from a mystery. Promise me you won't do anything reckless, I insisted. Of course, she agreed too readily. The following morning, Marilyn approached as I sat in the garden. She glanced around to ensure we were alone before leaning close, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Lorraine, it would be best if you didn't let that girl pry too much. Not everything should be dug up, especially matters concerning Charles. I stared at her, shocked by this unexpected breach in her professional demeanor. As she straightened and walked away, a question burned in my mind. What had Marilyn known all these years, silently watching me grieve while harboring secrets about my son's death? Despite my warnings, Ruby couldn't resist the mystery of the locked study. 2 nights after finding the key, she seized her opportunity when Stephen left for what he called an urgent client meeting. I pretended not to notice her slipping away after dinner, my heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. She returned to my room well past midnight, her face pale but her eyes alive with discovery. The room is immaculate, she whispered, closing my bedroom door carefully behind her. Too immaculate for a space that's supposedly just for storage. The dust is only on the surfaces meant to be seen, the desk, the bookshelves. But the filing cabinets? Clean as yesterday's laundry. What did you find? I asked, my voice barely audible. Ruby pulled several folded documents from inside her sweater. Charles's investment portfolio, or what's left of it. Every venture shows massive losses in the months before his death. I examined the papers, recognizing my son's signature on several forms, alongside Stephen's more angular scrawl on amendments and transfer authorizations. There's more, Ruby continued, unfolding another document. A copy of your husband's will from 15 years ago. It names Charles as the sole heir to the entire Whitmore estate. My hands trembled as I took the yellowed paper. This can't be right. Stephen told me that Richard's will divided the estate between Charles and several charitable foundations. Does that sound like something your husband would have done? I shook my head slowly. Richard believed family legacy was paramount. Everything to Charles was always the plan. A terrible realization dawned on me. Since Charles's death, Stephen had never once shown me the actual will, despite managing all the estate matters. Every document I'd signed over the past 8 years had been presented without context, just a signature line and Stephen's assurance that it was standard procedure or necessary paperwork. In my fog of grief, I'd signed whatever was placed before me, trusting the family lawyer who'd worked alongside my husband for decades. There's something else, Ruby said, hesitation evident in her voice. Some of these documents, the signatures don't match. I compared several pages with Charles's signature, and there are subtle differences in the later ones. Forgeries? I whispered. She nodded grimly. Sophisticated ones, and there was a drawer in the desk I couldn't access, locked with a different key. Whatever's in there must be important. Sleep eluded me that night. By morning, the pieces were forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. I confronted Marilyn as she brought my medication. What do you know about Charles's death that you've been keeping from me? I demanded. Her hands froze momentarily before resuming their methodical arrangement of pills. "I'm just your nurse, Mrs. Whitmore, not a detective." "You've been in this house for 12 years, I pressed. "You were here when Charles was alive, when he died, when Stephen took control. You've seen everything." Marilyn's professional mask slipped, just for a moment. "Some things are better left alone, especially at your age. What good would knowing do now?" "It's my son we're talking about." She sighed. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore. I truly am." She exited swiftly, leaving my questions hanging in the air. Stephen's behavior shifted noticeably in the days that followed. He began visiting more frequently, bringing small gifts, fresh flowers, imported chocolates, a cashmere shawl. His solicitous manner might have seemed thoughtful to an outsider, but I recognized it as the attention a farmer gives to livestock before slaughter. "We should finalize those documents I brought last week," he mentioned casually during one visit, "to ensure everything is in order when the time comes." "What's the rush, Stephen?" I asked, watching his face closely. "My doctors say I might have months yet." A flash of something, irritation, worry, crossed his features before his professional smile returned. "No rush at all. Just being thorough. It's what your husband would have wanted." That evening, Ruby and I sat in my private sitting room, the door locked, speaking in hushed tones. "Based on everything we've found," she said, "I think Stephen manipulated Charles into bad investments, drained his personal assets, then forged documents to access the family trusts. When Charles figured it out, it wasn't an accident," I finished, the words like ash in my mouth. "Stephen had my son killed because he was going to expose him." The truth hit me with physical force, a revelation that should have come years ago. I'd been blind, not just from grief, but from a lifetime of trusting the wrong people. For 8 years, I'd mourned in the same house as my son's murderer, signing papers that probably transferred my family's wealth into his control. "I've been such a fool," I whispered. Ruby shook her head. "You are a mother who lost her child. Grief makes us vulnerable." Later that week, Ruby overheard a phone call Stephen made from the garden. She'd been reading on a bench around the corner when his voice carried on the breeze. "We need to clean up every trace before the old woman figures anything out," he'd said to someone. "No, I can handle the girl if necessary. Just make sure those offshore accounts are untraceable." It was time to act. I needed help from someone Stephen couldn't intimidate or manipulate. "Franklin Hayes," I told Ruby. He was Richard's closest friend and financial advisor before retiring. "If anyone knows where to look for evidence against Stephen, it's Franklin." I hadn't spoken to Franklin in years, another connection Stephen had methodically severed after Charles's death. I searched my dresser for the old address book, then remembered it might be with the family photo albums. In the library, I pulled out a leather-bound album from the bottom shelf. As I flipped through pages of happier times, a loose photograph slipped out and drifted to the floor. I picked it up, then froze. The photo showed Charles at his last birthday celebration, just 2 months before his death. Standing behind him was Stephen, one hand resting on my son's shoulder in a gesture that might have seemed friendly to anyone else. But Stephen's smile didn't reach his eyes, which held a calculating coldness I'd never noticed before. What struck me most, however, was Charles's expression. His smile was forced, his posture tense, and his eyes, those kind eyes that had always looked at the world with curiosity and compassion, now held the unmistakable wariness of prey, aware of the predator at its back. My son had known he was being hunted. That photograph of Charles and Stephen haunted me through the night. By morning, I knew exactly who to call. Franklin Hayes had been my husband's closest confidant for over 40 years, a brilliant financial mind who'd retired just before Richard's death. If anyone could help us navigate the labyrinth Stephen had created, it would be Franklin. Ruby found his number in Richard's old address book. My hands shook as I dialed, praying he'd remember me after all these years of silence. Lorraine Whitmore, he answered after the second ring, his gravelly voice instantly familiar. Well, I'll be damned. Thought Stephen had locked you away in that mausoleum for good. Relief flooded through me. Franklin, you have no idea how good it is to hear your voice. We arranged to meet at a small cafe outside the city, where Stephen was unlikely to have connections. Ruby drove me there in one of the estate cars, both of us constantly checking for tails. Franklin hadn't changed much. Still barrel-chested with bushy white eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own. But his shrewd eyes had lost none of their sharpness. So Stephen Caldwell finally showed his true colors, he said after I'd explained our suspicions. Richard warned me about him, you know. Said there was something off about the man, the way he'd insinuated himself into the firm. Richard never mentioned any concerns to me, I said, surprised. Franklin's expression softened. You always saw the best in people, Lorraine. Richard didn't want to burden you with his suspicions. Besides, Stephen was clever, always proper, always efficient. Over the next week, Franklin worked with Ruby to analyze the financial documents she'd photographed from Stephen's study. They set up a secure communication channel using burner phones and encrypted messages that Stephen couldn't intercept. What they uncovered was staggering. It's not just embezzlement, Franklin explained during one of our clandestine calls. Stevens created an entire shadow financial system under the Whitmore assets. We've traced at least 12 offshore accounts in the Caymans, Singapore, and Switzerland, all operating under shell companies. How much has he stolen? I asked. At least 80 million so far, possibly more. But here's what's truly disturbing. There's an account in Charles's name that's still active. Money has moved through it as recently as last month. I gasped. But Charles has been dead for 8 years. Exactly. Stephen's been using your son's identity to move funds, probably since before his death. It's the perfect cover. Who would question transactions from the Whitmore heir? The magnitude of Stephen's betrayal left me breathless. He hadn't just stolen my family's money. He'd corrupted my son's legacy, using Charles as a puppet even after death. Franklin confirmed what Ruby had suspected about the signatures. They're definitely forgeries, sophisticated ones, but I had a forensic handwriting expert examine them discreetly. Stephen has been signing Charles's name for years, possibly during Charles's lifetime. The evidence mounted daily. Franklin discovered documents linking Stephen to international money laundering operations, using the Whitmore family's legitimate businesses as fronts. With newfound clarity and purpose, I confronted Marilyn again. This time, I wouldn't accept evasions. What did Charles tell you about Stephen before he died? I demanded, cornering her in the medicine room. Marilyn's professional facade cracked. After a long pause, she sighed deeply. He said Stephen wasn't the man everyone thought he was, that he didn't trust him anymore. And you never thought to tell me this? Her eyes dropped. You were devastated after his death. The doctors were concerned about your heart. And honestly, she hesitated. I was afraid of losing my position. Stephen made it clear that upsetting you with conspiracy theories wouldn't be tolerated. So you chose your job over the truth. I chose what seemed kindest at the time, she whispered. I was wrong. As Marilyn left, Ruby slipped in through the garden door, her expression grim. I overheard Stephen on the phone with someone. He's instructed Marilyn to keep closer tabs on both of us. He mentioned that an unfortunate accident might become necessary if things progress. Ice formed in my veins. He's threatening to kill us. He won't stop at threats, Ruby said. I found hidden cameras in the main hallway and living room. He's monitoring everything. Franklin confirmed our fears when we next spoke. This isn't just about money anymore, Lorraine. Stephen has too much to lose. If you expose him, he's looking at decades in prison. People like him don't just surrender when cornered. What should we do? Play along, Franklin advised. Act frail, confused, compliant. Let him think you're the same grieving, passive woman you've been for years. Meanwhile, we'll gather enough evidence to bring to the authorities. I embraced my new role with grim determination. When Stephen visited, I shuffled instead of walked, let my gaze wander vaguely during conversations, and frequently asked him to repeat himself. "I'm just so tired these days," I'd murmur, letting my hand tremble as I signed whatever he placed before me, documents Ruby had already photographed and Franklin had analyzed. Stephen seemed pleased with my apparent decline, his visits becoming more frequent, his manner almost jovial as he discussed arrangements for my comfort in my final days. Little did he know I was more alert than I'd been in years, my mind sharpened by purpose and rage. Later that week, as I dozed in my sitting room, my secure phone vibrated with a message from Franklin. "Lorraine, I've found Charles's life insurance policy. The beneficiary isn't you. It's Stephen Caldwell." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor as cold horror washed over me. This wasn't opportunistic theft after an unexpected death. Stephen had planned Charles's murder from the beginning, positioning himself to benefit financially when my son was gone. The monster I'd trusted had orchestrated everything. The revelation about Charles's life insurance was the final piece of a monstrous puzzle. Stephen hadn't just taken advantage of my son's death, he'd planned it, orchestrated it, profited from it. Cold fury replaced my shock, hardening my resolve. Ruby, Franklin, and I convened via encrypted video call that night, safely away from Stephen's surveillance network. My bedroom was the only place we'd confirmed had no cameras, likely due to some last vestige of propriety on Stephen's part. "We need ironclad evidence that will stand up in court," Franklin said, his face grave on the small screen. "Not just financial records, but direct proof of Stephen's involvement in Charles's death." We formulated a detailed plan. Franklin would engage an independent lawyer, someone with no connections to Boston's elite circles, and a financial forensic investigator who specialized in tracking money laundering operations. "I'll also reach out to an old contact at the FBI," Franklin added, quietly. "Someone who can move quickly once we have everything in place." Ruby, meanwhile, had been teaching herself digital security protocols. She showed me how to use encrypted messaging apps and secure cloud storage to transfer documents outside the mansion without detection. "We need to build a complete case before Stephen realizes what we're doing," she explained. "Once he suspects we're gathering evidence, we'll be in immediate danger." The most surprising development came from Marilyn. After our confrontation, she seemed to undergo a transformation. One morning, she slipped me a note during my medication routine. "Stephen asked about changing your pain management dosage." I refused. Later, when we could speak privately, Marilyn confirmed my suspicions. "He wanted me to increase your sedatives," she admitted, her professional demeanor cracking with genuine distress. "Said it would make things easier for everyone. I realized then he doesn't intend for you to linger much longer." Marilyn's cooperation became invaluable. She began documenting Stephen's comings and goings, reporting on phone calls he made from the house, and noting mysterious visitors who arrived in unmarked cars. "There's a man who comes every Tuesday evening," she told us. "They meet in the study with the door locked. Stephen calls him the consultant." Most disturbing was her revelation about my medication. "Stephen has been suggesting subtle changes to your prescriptions for years," she admitted. "Nothing obvious enough to raise alarms, but enough to keep you foggy, weak, dependent." The extent of Stephen's manipulation staggered me. He'd been slowly poisoning me, keeping me docile while he stripped away my fortune and my dignity. To advance our plan, I requested a private meeting with Stephen, claiming anxiety about my will. "I'm concerned about Ruby," I told him, affecting a quaver in my voice. "She's been asking questions about my assets. I fear she might have designs on the estate." Stephen's eyes gleamed with barely concealed satisfaction. I've had similar concerns, Mrs. Whitmore. Perhaps we should revisit your arrangements. During our meeting, I noticed a USB drive peeking from his jacket pocket as he leaned forward to show me documents. When he left to take a call, I mentioned it to Ruby. That could contain everything we need, she whispered. Financial records, communications, evidence. That night, Ruby made her most dangerous move yet, breaking into Stephen's home office to search for the USB drive. She found it in his desk drawer, but as she was preparing to leave, she heard keys in the front door. She hid behind heavy drapes as Stephen entered, followed by a stranger in an expensive suit. For nearly an hour, she remained frozen while they discussed cleanup operations and contingency plans if I became problematic. Ruby might have been trapped until morning if not for Marilyn, who created a diversion by triggering a medical alert on my monitoring system. When Stephen rushed out to check on me, Ruby escaped through the garden. The contents of the USB drive exceeded our darkest expectations. Spreadsheets detailed millions funneled through shell companies. The life insurance policy named Stephen as Charles's beneficiary, with a payout of $5 million. Most damning was an audio file, a recording between Stephen and someone identified only as Jay. Charles was too soft to handle, Stephen's voice said clearly. I just helped speed things along. The brake lines were the simplest solution. I wept as I listened, rage and grief flooding through me in equal measure. My son hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered, coldly and methodically, by a man who'd continued to look me in the eye day after day for 8 years. Our plans accelerated as Stephen began showing signs of suspicion. He questioned Marilyn about items moved in his office. Security personnel appeared at the estate gates. The cameras in the common areas were upgraded to more sophisticated models. He's turning the mansion into a prison, Ruby observed as another security technician arrived. Communications with Franklin became increasingly difficult as Stephen monitored all incoming and outgoing calls. We needed to get the USB drive to Franklin, but leaving the estate had become nearly impossible. Finally, Marilyn proposed a solution. Mrs. Whitmore needs an MRI that can't be performed here, she informed Stephen with professional authority. Her oncologist insists it be done at Massachusetts General. I'll accompany her, of course. Stephen hesitated, then nodded curtly. Take Thomas as driver, he instructed, referring to one of his security men. At the hospital, while Thomas waited in the lobby, Marilyn created another diversion, accidentally spilling coffee on his suit. In those brief moments while he cleaned himself, Franklin's associate slipped past, and I pressed the USB drive into his hand. Everything you need is there, I whispered. Hurry. The drive back to the estate was tense but uneventful. Relief flooded through me as we passed through the gates. We'd successfully transferred the evidence. Franklin would deliver it to the FBI within hours. That sense of triumph evaporated instantly when I saw Stephen standing at the front entrance, his face a mask of icy calculation. As Thomas helped me from the car, Stephen leaned close, his breath hot against my ear. I hope your outing wasn't for anything foolish, he murmured. Because if it was, the next body to leave this house will be Ruby's. My heart seized with terror. He knew. Somehow he knew what we'd done. Stephen's threat against Ruby made one thing painfully clear. We were running out of time. In the days that followed, his control over the mansion tightened like a vice. Unfamiliar men in workmen's uniforms appeared throughout the grounds, ostensibly performing repairs but strategically positioned to watch all entrances and exits. 2 new security consultants took up residence in the guest house, monitoring the property around the clock. My movements became severely restricted, with Stephen insisting I was too fragile to move about unassisted. Every conversation with Ruby was interrupted by Marilyn, now under orders to provide hourly reports on our activities. He's preparing for something, Ruby whispered during one of our few private moments in my bedroom. Marilyn had disabled the surveillance there, creating our only sanctuary. He knows we have the evidence, I replied. He's just not sure what we've done with it. Our secure channel to Franklin remained our lifeline. His message that evening was both encouraging and alarming. The FBI has the evidence, he reported. They're building a case as we speak. The financial crimes alone would put Stephen away for decades, and the murder evidence is compelling. But these things take time. Warrants, approvals, coordination. They're talking about another 48 hours minimum. 2 more days under Stephen's increasingly hostile surveillance felt like an eternity. We needed to accelerate matters. I have an idea, I told Ruby and Marilyn during our midnight council. Something that might force Stephen to show his hand before he can act against us. The next morning, I summoned Stephen to my room, claiming increasing pain that required his immediate attention. He arrived promptly, concern etched on his face. Concern I now recognized, not for my well-being but for his plans, should my health genuinely deteriorate before he was ready. Stephen, I began weakly. I've been thinking about my will again. Interest flickered in his eyes. Oh? I thought we'd settled those matters. I want to make a change, I said. I'd like to establish a charitable foundation in Charles's name. The Charles Whitmore Foundation would receive the bulk of the estate. The effect was immediate. A muscle twitched in Stephen's jaw, his composure slipping for the first time in all the years I'd known him. A foundation? He repeated, his voice tight. That seems unnecessarily complicated at this stage, Lorraine. It's what I want, I insisted. Charles should have a legacy beyond his accident. Stephen's eyes darkened at the slight emphasis I placed on the word accident. He leaned closer, his facade of concern morphing into something more predatory. If you pursue this change, he said quietly, I'm afraid you won't live long enough to sign the paperwork. Is that a threat, Stephen? It's an observation, he replied smoothly. Your health is fragile. Perhaps what you need is a quiet retreat somewhere peaceful, somewhere I can ensure you receive proper care, away from distractions. I recognized the implied threat. No one would question if I never returned from such a retreat. What Stephen didn't realize was that Ruby had positioned her phone behind a vase, recording every word of his thinly veiled threat. Another piece of evidence for Franklin's growing arsenal. That night, however, Stephen moved more quickly than we anticipated. Marilyn burst into my room just after midnight, her face pale with urgency. He's sabotaged the balcony railing outside Ruby's room, she whispered. I saw him testing it. It would give way with the slightest pressure. We rushed to warn Ruby, barely intercepting her before she stepped onto the balcony for her nightly cigarette. The setup was as brutal as it was clever. The fall would have appeared accidental, the balcony's age providing a plausible explanation. Our time had run out. We needed to end this before Stephen succeeded in eliminating any of us. I'm going to host a farewell dinner, I announced the next morning. For all of us. My doctor says I don't have much time left, and I'd like one last formal dinner in the main dining room. Stephen seemed pleased by this development, likely seeing it as an opportunity to enact whatever plan he'd been formulating. Ruby and Marilyn understood their roles perfectly. We'd thoroughly discussed our strategy during the night. The dining room was prepared with its finest service, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier. I insisted on wearing my most elegant attire, diamond earrings and all. If this was to be my final confrontation with Stephen Caldwell, I would face him as Lorraine Whitmore, not as the feeble invalid he'd tried to create. Stephen arrived punctually, dressed impeccably as always. His smile faltered slightly at seeing me looking more alert and composed than I had in months. As the first course was served, I steered the conversation with unexpected directness. Let's talk about Charles, I said, watching Stephen over the rim of my water glass. His fork paused midway to his mouth. I'm not sure this is an appropriate dinner topic, given your fragile emotional state? Oh, I think it's exactly what we should discuss, I continued. Specifically, the circumstances of his death. Stephen placed his fork down carefully. Lorraine, we've been through this. It was a tragic accident. Was it? I interrupted. Because I've recently discovered some interesting things, like offshore accounts in Charles's name that continued to receive transfers years after his death. His expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Or the life insurance policy naming you as beneficiary, I continued, my voice strengthening. Or the recorded conversation where you discussed cutting my son's brake lines. The color drained from Stephen's face. Ruby and Marilyn remained silent, watching him carefully. You're confused, he said, but there was a tremor in his voice. The medication is affecting your mind. I smiled thinly. The FBI doesn't seem to think so. They're quite interested in the evidence we've provided. Something snapped in Stephen's eyes. In one fluid motion, he reached into his jacket and produced a knife, lunging across the table to press it against my throat. Sign the transfer documents, he hissed. Now, full control of all Whitmore assets to me, or I'll finish you right here. Stephen Caldwell, I said calmly, despite the blade against my skin. You are a disappointment. His eyes widened at my composure. In that moment of confusion, Ruby pressed a hidden button under the table, a silent alarm Franklin had installed during his last visit. The dining room doors burst open as FBI agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Stephen was wrestled to the ground, the knife clattering across the hardwood floor. As they handcuffed him, reading him his rights, the polished veneer that had been Stephen Caldwell for decades completely dissolved. His face contorted with rage, spittle flying as he screamed. You think you've won, Lorraine? You're just the last piece of the puzzle. The others won't let this stand. I watched calmly as they led him away, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders for the first time in 8 years. Charles can rest now, Ruby said softly, standing beside me. As the last agent exited, promising to return for formal statements, I finally allowed myself a moment of relief. Justice for Charles was within reach at last. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I noticed an envelope on my pillow that hadn't been there before. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one typed line. We're not finished yet, Whitmore. I clutched the paper tightly, a chill running through me. Stephen's arrest wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Stephen Caldwell's arrest made national headlines within hours. Whitmore family lawyer charged with fraud murder dominated the front pages. News vans lined up outside our gates, reporters clamoring for statements, photographers angling for a glimpse inside the mansion that had become the scene of such betrayal. I watched it unfold with a strange detachment. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with old money respectability, was now entangled in a sordid tale of greed, manipulation, and murder. Society columnists wrote breathless pieces about the fall of Boston's elite, speculating wildly about the family's secret darkness. But I found myself surprisingly unburdened by their judgments. The weight that had pressed upon me for 8 years, the unspoken grief, the nebulous suspicions, the fog of half-truths, had finally lifted. Charles's name would be cleared. That was all that mattered now. The FBI investigation uncovered even more than we had found. They discovered payments to a mechanic who'd specialized in untraceable vehicle modifications shortly before Charles's accident. Bank records revealed a shell company Stephen had created solely to hire the man who tampered with my son's car. Your son was onto him, Agent Rivera told me during one of our many interviews. Based on the evidence, Charles had begun gathering documentation of Stephen's embezzlement. Stephen couldn't let that continue. Though we couldn't restore everything Charles had lost, his reputation was reclaimed. The financial losses that had been attributed to his poor judgment were revealed as Stephen's elaborate fraud. The whispers of a reckless heir who'd squandered the family fortune were replaced by the truth. a young man who discovered corruption and paid the ultimate price for his integrity. 3 weeks after Stephen's arrest, I held my first and only press conference in the garden. Franklin stood beside me, with Ruby slightly behind, my unlikely family of choice. The Whitmore fortune was built on my husband's belief that wealth carries responsibility, I told the assembled reporters. Today, I'm announcing the dissolution of my personal estate and the establishment of the Charles Whitmore Foundation. Cameras flashed as I outlined the foundation's mission: to provide legal and financial support to young people trapped in predatory financial situations and to fund investigations into white-collar crime. Franklin Hayes would serve as executive director, with Ruby Clark as his deputy. My son was silenced when he tried to expose corruption, I concluded. This foundation will ensure others in similar situations have a voice and the support they need to be heard. After the press left, Marilyn approached me in the sitting room, her uniform replaced by civilian clothes, a small suitcase by her side. "I've tendered my resignation," she said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness, Mrs. Whitmore. I should have spoken up years ago." I nodded, understanding her need to distance herself from the house and its memories. "You did the right thing in the end, Marilyn. That counts for something." I handed her an envelope containing a modest but significant sum, enough to start fresh somewhere far from Boston. She accepted it with tears in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement passing between us before she walked out of the mansion for the last time. The anonymous note remained our only unsolved mystery. The FBI found no fingerprints, no clues to its origin. Despite increased security and a thorough sweep for surveillance devices, we never discovered who had entered the mansion to leave it on my pillow. Franklin suggested it might be a desperate attempt by one of Stephen's associates to frighten us into silence, a theory that seemed plausible, but somehow incomplete. As my health continued its inevitable decline, I found myself drawn to the window seat where I'd first spotted Ruby. The garden was blooming with summer flowers now, so different from the snow-covered scene of our first encounter. I felt a profound peace watching the seasons change, knowing I had finally fulfilled my responsibility to Charles. On what would be my last night, Ruby came to say goodbye. She was leaving for New York the next morning to set up the Foundation's East Coast office. "I never thanked you properly," she said, sitting beside my bed. "You changed my life when you brought me here." I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "And you saved mine, Ruby. We both survived." "I'll continue the work," she promised. "For Charles. For you." I reached for a sealed envelope on my nightstand and pressed it into her hands. "This is for you. Don't open it unless you feel lost." She nodded, tucking it carefully into her jacket. We said our goodbyes simply, neither of us believing in overwrought farewells. We'd said what mattered in the months we'd spent bringing Stephen to justice. 2 days later, as the morning sun streamed through my window, I felt a peculiar lightness. I settled into my favorite chair overlooking the garden, watching birds flit between branches, feeling my breathing grow shallow. My thoughts turned to Charles, not to his death, but to his laughter as a child, his serious expressions when concentrating on a chess move, his gentle way with people. I closed my eyes, smiling. Charles had justice at last. I could join him in peace. 3 months after my death, Ruby stood on a balcony in Chicago, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk descended. The Charles Whitmore Foundation was thriving, having already helped dozens of young victims of financial predators. The FBI had successfully prosecuted Stephen Caldwell, who received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Yet Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that the mystery wasn't fully solved. Stephen's words about the others and the anonymous note suggested a wider conspiracy that remained unexposed. She reached into her coat and withdrew the envelope I'd given her. Though not lost in the conventional sense, she felt the need for guidance as she contemplated the Foundation's next steps. Inside was a single sheet of my personal stationery. My handwriting, grown shaky but still elegant, conveyed a simple message. If you discover who stands behind Stephen, remember this: the Whitmore family never learned to bow. Ruby folded the letter carefully, her gaze turning resolute as she looked out over the city. As she slipped the letter back into her pocket, her phone chimed with an incoming email. The sender was unfamiliar, the subject line direct. "We need to talk about Stephen Caldwell." A slight smile played across Ruby's face as she murmured to the empty night air. "So the game has only just begun."